He was a man of many faces. Revolutionary hero, a godlike figure to the people, and a pop icon to the world. Mao's image would control a nation for over half a century. And even in death, his presence lives on. It was a sight to behold, a euphoria like no other, for the beloved Chairman Mao had arrived. Mao's face provided a happy image for the Chinese in posters across the country. His smile promised a kinder world, and hopes and dreams that everyone could share in. In 1949, the Communist Party took power in China, and Mao Zedong, a humble revolutionary, became a Red Star.
And there, in the tradition of emperors before him, stood Mao Zedong.
To begin with, the Communists captured their victorious arrival in Beijing on film. The world's largest propaganda effort had begun.
For the first time in 100 years, the only troops parading through China's streets were Chinese.
Visual propaganda. It was important from 1949 when the Communist Party came to power. Remember, this is a time there's no television. There are not that many movie theaters either when you consider that China was a rural country. And so art, poster art and photographic art, all of these kinds of things become incredibly important. Large posters that are put up in the streets, people are bicycling by on the way to school, they're going to work, and they're exposed to these things all the time.
Torn apart by a civil war and foreign invaders, China in the 1930s was in need of a hero. Mao and the Red Army took root in the country's remote villages. The Communists were outnumbered by their enemy, the ruling Nationalist Party. But they were united with the peasants in a single cause: to liberate the people from the tyranny of the imperial government. To support the revolution, early artists had already begun to depict Mao through woodcuts. Although a minor figure in the Communist Party's inception, his stature grew. Mao's first taste of publicity came with journalist Edgar Snow's landmark portrait of their struggle, Red Star over China. Snow's insider account revealed the gritty exploits of China's communist fighters to the world and gave fuel to their revolutionary cause. A key episode in building Mao's legend was the Long March, an epic military retreat which saw the communists trek some 8,000 miles on foot to evade the enemy. By surviving the Long March, Mao and the Red Army became even greater heroes to the peasants and fed Mao's growing propaganda efforts. The color red has traditionally been associated with happiness, prosperity, and vitality for ages past in China. Red posters and art prints, inscripted with well wishes, typically adorn households during occasions such as weddings and the Lunar New Year. But when the communists came into power, they would soon change this ancient tradition.
Once the Chinese Communist Party was confronted with a possibility that all of China would fall in its lap, they were desperately starting to look around for a visual form that not only pleased the peasantry, but the urban population as well.
The Red Star itself personified socialism and communism as decreed by Karl Marx and Engels. It was also the perfect color for China's new revolution. The people warmly welcomed Mao's new visual art. And more, communism imposed its brushstrokes onto the lives of the masses. Central to China's propaganda movement was the influence of Russia's social realist art. The Soviets had provided the Chinese with both the ideology and technology to kickstart the revolution. But more importantly, their art held the key to reaching the masses. China's traditional brush paintings and crafts were far too abstract and ornate. Chinese artists had to be sent to Russia to learn a completely new visual language and make it their own.
我们那个时期在这个创作方面强调生活，我们那个时候还是这一点上来说是比较严谨的。你就比如说吧，我们学生时期就是下乡啊、三同啊、同吃同住同劳动，体验生活，那还是比较下功夫啊。
In ruling the Soviet Republic, Stalin had established his own cult of personality. After taking over China in 1949, Mao too would do the same. The Cold War itself was an ongoing campaign of propaganda, as different nations fought to win the minds of their people. But nowhere else was this as pervasive as in China. To win the hearts and minds of the people, Mao harnessed the arts to change the way people thought and lived. From performance in music to literature and the visual arts, gradually all art forms would serve one purpose only: the Communist Party's ongoing manifesto.
I think it is rather amazing that the art had such an impact in that period. There was no unified language when the communists came to power, and that's one of the reasons that they produced the simplified characters and did away with the complex classical characters, simply because you could not spread the word of revolution across China if you couldn't articulate it in minority languages. So visually, these were incredibly far-reaching in their impact. And this was something that for the peasant people was just such an extraordinary revolution in its own. So you have a lot of those sort of posters about how people are going out to help each other. So they have that community spirit rather than being necessarily purely political.
因为这个艺术啊，原来是听着指令啊做，你完全没有什么这个你自己的想法，你就去做就完了。你只画红光亮高大全，你要攥着大拳头啊，什么打击敌人啊，我们怎么强壮？
所以艺术家就是这个革命机器中的一个螺丝钉，就你要是要为人民服务，又为党的政策服务。进入工艺美术学院之后，老师的第一个任务就是打消你要做艺术家的这个念头。他一再跟你讲，工艺美术学院不是培养艺术家，工艺美术学院是培养工艺美术设计人才，要为生产服务，为社会，为人民服务，要生产这个老百姓能够用的东西。
Mao's propaganda reached out to the masses with various messages, campaigns, and reforms. state controlled all arts and culture through an intricate bureaucracy that extended from the ministry to the schools. Initially, early propaganda art in the 50s encompassed different styles and influences, but this gradually changed.
1957年之前，我们所接触的这些都是为艺术而艺术更多一点。到后来57年以后就变了艺术为政治服务，一直到文化大革命，我们自己要改造思想，要去做为工农兵服务的工作，就一直天天想这个，这就是很长的一段时间。
In shaping his utopian vision, Mao wanted to show the world that China too could be a modern nation. In the countryside, he abolished private property and reorganized people into communes. Everyone now had to live and work together under the state. Political meetings replaced traditional ceremonies as Mao's propaganda became all-important.
你像我们那个年龄吧，那时候是刚刚20出头，那时候很理想主义的，而且觉得，毛泽东讲的话，觉得这个，比如说横扫一切牛鬼蛇神啦，造反有理啦，就很浪漫，很理想主义。而且呢，那个时候再加上你知道，青春期、荷尔蒙、反叛精神，我觉得都凑在一起的话，就是说你很容易也变成一个狂热分子。
By this time, Mao, the once humble rebel, was enjoying a newfound popularity among the men and women. He declared that women held up half the sky and played a crucial role in China's reforms. He boldly granted them equal rights, something that was unheard of. Old rituals such as foot binding and child marriages were abolished. Once demure and feminine, Chinese women were now portrayed as independent individuals, ready to take on masculine roles.
I tend to compare Chinese propaganda posters with Hollywood movies, in the sense that nobody ever needs to go to the bathroom. Miners come out of the pit with squeaky clean white shirts on instead of all black on their face. So in a way, it's not a real reality. It remains very difficult to actually portray reality as it is.
Even as China became increasingly isolated from the outside world, Mao actively promoted China's communist agenda. He forged new friendships internationally, and at the same time, helped smaller regimes like North Korea and Vietnam fight against American imperialism. In the 60s, he even championed the Black American struggle for equal rights.
Internationalism is a huge theme. You know, at the ideological level, it's still important to them that they connect to the rest of the world. And so you get these fantastic posters that will have this large cast of international characters. And part of it is a fantasy world. That is to say, if we're looking at African revolutionaries, or we're looking at Vietnamese, or we're looking at people from Latin America, they're all holding Chairman Mao's little red book, and it seems like, you know, they acknowledge Mao as the leader of the world revolution. So it's a fantasy world that we see. People would look at this work and they would then fantasize about the world outside China. I wonder what the world outside China is really like. And so in some ways it's very titillating in ways that I think was probably not intended.
In 1957, Mao embarked on his most ambitious plan. His aim? To transform millions of farmers into an industrialized superpower. He called it the Great Leap Forward.
This was unprecedented in the communist world, this notion that you could almost overnight achieve the utopian communist society.
Farmers were told to produce steel in homemade furnaces. Mao's radical aim was to overtake the West in steel production, at any cost. Without any expertise or resources, however, farmers could only churn out unusable pig iron. Having abandoned their fields for the furnaces, many villages ran out of food, and China found itself facing the worst man-made famine in history. Although tens of millions starved to death, Mao continued to hide the truth from the world. The propaganda boasted record growth and bumper crops, and posters showed everyone there was still plenty to eat. But Mao's failure in the Great Leap Forward shook his leadership. Premier Liu Shaoqi and other officials criticized Mao's radical approach. They had advocated more pragmatic measures, which Mao ignored. Under pressure in 1959, Mao stepped down as China's leader. During the early 60s, Mao faced his darkest hour as his political opponents surrounded him. Although he remained the figurehead of the party, Mao no longer enjoyed the power he once had.
Mao reached the conclusion in 1966, the final conclusion, that the main obstacle to achieving the grandiose utopian revolutionary goals he had in mind was in fact the Communist Party itself and the bureaucracy that ran the nation.
To regain leadership of his country, Mao declared war against his own Communist Party, accusing them of becoming capitalist and bourgeois in their policies. He would trigger an event that would change China forever, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Mao's allies were student activists who called themselves the Red Guards. Like Mao, they too had accused their school establishment of becoming elitist. Mao seized the opportunity to mobilize the Red Guards. He called upon them to stamp out the country's old ideas, cultures, habits, and customs.
在无产阶级文化大革命进入批判资产阶级反动路线的新高潮中。
Fired up by Mao, millions of Red Guards converged in Beijing to pledge their allegiance to the chairman. (1966) saw Mao make the first of several appearances in Tiananmen Square. Like the Beatles in the West, Mao left no doubt as to who was number one.
那时候我觉得每个人的心情就像对待一个神谕，就是神发下来的一个指令，大家要欢呼，要庆祝。
整个会议快结束的时候，毛主席从那后台也出来了，出来呢，没讲话，向那个观众挥手致意，非常激动，感觉非常幸福。
毛主席万岁，就在那喊呐，是吧？都是看见毛主席，毛主席说“人民万岁”，就是这样的“人民万岁”。那个广场那个声音啊，我们都是讲话声音都听不见，就是毛主席万岁，毛主席万岁，很热闹的。
那种伟人的那种气质，那么使我深受震撼。我可以看到他在天安门那个城楼上的那个气质那种状态，特别是他挥舞帽子跟这个群众这挥舞时候那种气质，真是不是一般人所能具备的。所以他从我内心里产生一种震撼的。所以我后来就是在作品，在我创作的这个毛主席题材作品上，就是想要把他这种内心能震撼我内心的这种气质，想把它画出来。